Dave, hello everyone. My name is Kevin Byrne and I'm the Consul General here at the Irish Consulate to the Midwest based in Chicago. I hope you're all enjoying this St. Patrick's Day celebration at home. It's a great time to spend time with family and friends and think about our shared heritage. And I really want to thank you for joining this session on the War of Independence. We're living through a decade that's rich in commemorations on some of the most important events in modern Irish history: the Easter Rising in 1916, the first Dáil or Irish Parliament, the War of Independence, the Civil War, the foundation of the Free State, and the creation of Northern Ireland, and many others. The events of a century ago have shaped our land and our politics. And while these are national events, they're also personal events for many families, with many people not many generations removed from the acts and events of the period. My own grandfather, for instance, fought in the War of Independence and the Civil War, and no doubt you and your families have stories from those times. As we celebrate our National Day, it's only fitting that we take the opportunity to reflect on our shared history. And I want to thank CelticMKE, as always, for providing such a wonderful opportunity. We've an engaging and expert panel of speakers who will bring this seminal period of Irish history to life. Our main speaker is Ambassador Dan Mulhall, Ireland's ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Mulhall took up duty as Ireland's 18th ambassador to the US in August 2017. He's a proud Waterford man who did his undergraduate and postgraduate studies at UCC, where he specialised in modern Irish history. In his over 40-year career, he has served in New Delhi, Vienna, Brussels, Edinburgh, as Ireland's ambassador to Malaysia and to Germany. And prior to his posting here in the States, he served as our ambassador to London during a very interesting time in British politics. He was also part of the Irish government's delegation at the time of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, probably the key achievement of Irish foreign policy over the last 30 or 40 years. Ambassador Mulhall maintains a keen interest in Irish history and literature. He's the author of A New Day Dawning, a portrait of Ireland in 1900, and co-editor of The Shaping of Modern Ireland, a centenary assessment. Many of you will know him from his social media presence, where he blogs and tweets regularly about Irish poetry and other key events happening in Ireland. After the ambassador speaks, he'll take questions from two panelists, both of them well known to you. The first panelist will be Colleen Ward. Colleen is, of course, president of the Milwaukee Irish Fest Foundation and is a past president of the Milwaukee Irish Fest. She's been involved in the Milwaukee Irish Fest since its early days, as her brother Ed Ward was its founder. Irish Fest is truly a passion and really a way of life for her and her family. Colleen is responsible for diplomatic relations and guest relations, serving as the CelticMKE ambassador to governments and other entities in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and has built numerous relationships over many years. And I got to see the warmth of that welcome just a couple of months ago after I arrived here in Chicago, so my thanks to Colleen. The Milwaukee Irish Fest Foundation in its 25 years has provided grants of more than $650,000 to non-profit organisations in the US and in Ireland and Northern Ireland, a really phenomenal contribution. The priorities of the foundation are Irish culture and education and support of community endeavours. Professor Tim McMahon is the Associate Professor of History at Marquette University in Milwaukee and the past president of the American Conference of Irish Studies. Tim is a social historian with interests in nationalism and national identity, popular culture, particularly popular religion, and empire. He is the author of numerous books, including Grand Opportunity, The Gaelic Revival and Irish Society, and editor of Pádraig Ó Faithí's War of Independence, Recollections of a Galway Gaelic Leaguer, and Ireland in an Imperial World, Citizenship, Opportunism and Subversion. Tim was the Reverend William Neenan Visiting Fellow at Boston College, Ireland in 2011 and received the Franklin Research Grant from the American Philosophical Society in 2017. He was also a visiting research professor at the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's University in Belfast in 2018, and he also received in 2018 the Wakefinger Fellowship in the Humanities and Social Sciences for Marquette, a 3-year award to facilitate work on his current book project about the impact of Irish partition on identities across the island. Now, before I hand over to the ambassador and to the panelists, let me wish you and yours the very best for a healthy and happy St. Patrick's Day. Ambassador, please, over to you.
Okay, well, look, in any historical talk or lecture, you have to answer 3 questions, and they're very simple questions, really. They are what, how, and why. And if you can answer those questions, you've kind of, and then there's the when question. That's usually easier because that's kind of a set of dates, which lends itself to very straightforward. answer. The other three questions tend to be a bit more complicated, usually. Almost invariably, history is more complicated than it seems when you start off looking at it. And so I'm going to try and answer those questions, because if you answer those questions, you've generally speaking got to the bottom of most historical situations. So we start with the, with the what question. Well, for me at least, the what is that Ireland was transformed between 1912 and 1922. In 1912, it was part of the United Kingdom, the British Empire, and it was headed for some form of home rule, which I think in American terms could be equated to Ireland being a state of its own, like Illinois or whatever, or Wisconsin or Michigan within the United Kingdom or the British Empire, right? So a form of self-government was what most Irish people were looking for in 1914. By 1922, they had effectively an independent country, albeit some limitations on its independence were still in place, but they were quickly shed. So it really was a landmark decade. In fact, that decade was probably the most consequential decade in modern Irish history, and that is in Irish history between 1798 and the present day. So the key event, and if you ask yourself, well, when, the when question, when did it all start? Well, I suppose you could say the War of Independence started in 1916 with the Easter Rising, because that was when the spark was lit that eventually turned itself into an independence struggle, which produced the Irish Free State in 1922, following the War of Independence and so forth. So the Easter Rising, just briefly, for those, I'm sure most Irish Americans, most people on this podcast probably know about the Easter Rising, but it was a rebellion that took place in Dublin in Easter week 1916. And remarkably, in contrast with the various uprisings that had occurred in the 19th century, the uprising of Robert Emmet in 1804, 1803, the Young Ireland uprising of the 1840s, and the Fenian uprising of the 1860s. Actually, the Easter Rising was a relatively successful affair, because whereas the other events I've mentioned in the 19th century had fizzled out pretty quickly, although they left a legacy. Of course, the legacy is more important maybe than the events, but the Easter Rising was a substantial event whereby the Republic was declared in 1916, and it lasted for the best part of a week before the overwhelming might of the British forces crushed the rebellion, and 15 of the leaders of the Rising were executed. So 1916, you have what looks like a failed rising, although a respectable effort at challenging British rule in Ireland, more so than anything else that had happened before. So that could have been that. The Irish Party, which had dominated Irish politics since the 1870s, could well have come back and used the Easter Rising maybe to up its demand for maybe a fuller form of home rule, a more powerful form of home rule might have been a consequence of the Easter Rising had the Irish Party managed to reassert its political ascendancy in Ireland. But that didn't happen. Now, W.B. Yeats wrote in 1916, just after the Rising, he said, all changed utterly. Now, in 1916, there was no guarantee that everything had changed utterly, because, as I said, it could quite easily have resulted in the wise old birds in the Irish Party, most of whom have been around for decades. They could have reasserted themselves and pressed on with home rule. And that would have, of course, changed Ireland's subsequent history quite dramatically. So the question then is, how did these people who fought in the 1916 Rising, how did they manage to turn the tables, not just on the Irish Party, which had dominated Irish politics for 40 years or more, and on the British government, which, after all, didn't want to concede any form of independence to Ireland, didn't want to concede anything more than home rule to Ireland. So how did that happen? It wasn't inevitable by any means, but it happened for a number of reasons. First of all, those who took part in the Easter Rising were part of a new generation of Irish people. And the best study of this is probably Roy Foster's Vivid Faces, which is a study of the revolutionary generation. And it makes the point that there was a kind of a new ethos, a new mindset at large in Ireland in that first 20 years of the 20th century. And what you have to look at is, look at the ages of the people on the two sides of the nationalist argument. On the one hand, you had Redmond, and then after Redmond died, John Dillon. Now, John Dillon was born in 1851. So by 1918, he was in his 60s. Eamon de Valera, who came to be the leader of Sinn Féin, was a man born in 1882. So he was more than a generation younger than John Dillon. So there was a different kind of mindset at work among that younger generation. They were also the first generation of Irish nationalists who had been educated to the highest level possible. In other words, De Valera, MacDonagh, Pearse had all studied to university level at what was the Catholic University or now UCD. Previous generations of Irish nationalists, only a small number of them had been able to get university education, either by going abroad, if they could afford it, or by going to Trinity College and ignoring the fact that Trinity wasn't particularly, suitable for Irish nationalists for most of the time. So a younger generation, they were determined. When they were released from internment either in late 1916 or in 1917, they came out determined to build upon the legacy of the heroes, the martyrs of 1916. And they set about creating a new national movement, which would not only challenge the ascendancy of the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by Dillon and Redmond, but also would mount a strong challenge to British rule in Ireland. Now, in 1917, Sinn Féin won 4 by-election victories. But in 1918, the Irish Party won 3 by-elections. So if you were looking at the situation in 1918, you might say, well, it could go either way. These young bucks in Sinn Féin could assert themselves, could manage to win the day. But the old hands in the Irish Party haven't given up the ghost yet. They're still part of the party, still part of the political scene here in Ireland. The death knell of the Irish Party and the triumph of Sinn Féin was created not in Dublin, but in London, with a ham-fisted attempt to impose conscription on Ireland. Now, before 1918, when the British government decided in a panic, because the things were going badly on the Western Front, that they needed to impose conscription on Ireland, Ireland had been exempt from conscription. Other parts of Britain people had been conscripted, but Irish people had to volunteer for service, and many did. After all, 200,000 Irish-born people served on the battlefields of the Great War between 1914 and 1918, but there was no conscription. And when the British government decided to impose conscription on Ireland, they never did it, of course, but they announced it. And that, of course, led to a complete wipeout for the Irish Party, because suddenly they were the ones that, in protest against this move, decided to withdraw from the British Parliament, thereby embracing the policy of abstentionism that Sinn Féin had been promoting for the previous number of years, and indeed back to when Sinn Féin was founded in 1905. So sadly for the Irish Party, their friends in the government in London didn't do them any favors, and they got scant reward for their, full-blooded support for enlistment by Irish people during the First World War. And that, of course, changed everything in Ireland. And in the election of December 1918, which, by the way, was fought with an electorate that was way, way bigger than anything that had ever been before, because in 1918, women over 30 who qualified with a property qualification were able to vote, and also all men over the age of 21. So the electorate went, I think it sort of more than doubled in size. So it was a much better reflection of the population of Ireland than any previous election had been. And lo and behold, Sinn Féin won 47% of the vote. Not an overall majority, it has to be said, but nonetheless, 47% of the vote. And they won 73 of the 100 seats in the that were available to Irish constituency in the Westminster Parliament. But of course, the Sinn Féin people who won those seats never took their seats. They decided to establish their own parliament in Dublin. And remarkably, really, because remember, the election results were only declared in the last week of December 1918. And within a month, a new parliament had been convened in Dublin, made up of those who were members of Sinn Féin who had been elected under the Sinn Féin banner, firstly, and those who were available to go to the parliament because many of them were in jail or were on the run. So only, I think, 27 of the 73 managed to turn up. But it was a remarkable show of self-confidence and brio. And the other thing was, you might have expected these novice politicians to have decided, well, we better try and test the waters and see if we can negotiate something with the British. No, they went bald-headed, and they, on the first day of the first Dáil, on the 21st of January 1919, they went ahead and they declared independence. So none of this shilly-shallying, none of this kind of, let's see if we can find a compromise. Go for it. That was the attitude. And that reflected their youth and inexperience, that they simply didn't have the reflex that politicians would have had if they'd been more experienced, of saying, let's try and do a deal with the British and see what we can bring about by way of a compromise. So they issued a Declaration of Independence. They issued a democratic program, a very ambitious program of socioeconomic promises. And they also issued a message to the free nations of the world. And that was essentially Irish America. They were appealing to Irish America to recognize the new reality of Irish independence declared by the first Dáil. Now, it so happens that on the day when the Dáil met and declared independence, the first shots were fired in the War of Independence. That was a coincidence, because it wasn't as if the Sinn Féin leadership sent instructions out to their volunteers in County Tipperary and said, you must attack a police convoy and you must grab the gelignite that they were transporting from one place to another. No, it was local volunteers on the ground who decided themselves to do a bit of violent activity by ambushing a police patrol and killing 2 policemen. And that started what we call the War of Independence, sometimes called the Anglo-Irish War. Now, of course, it wasn't a war, because it didn't have any of the pitched battles that you might associate with a war, and nor did it have the sort of sieges that occurred in Dublin in 1916, where the volunteers took over public buildings and basically barricaded themselves in there and waited to be taken out by superior British forces. No, this was a war. This was a guerrilla war. Before that name was invented, it was a guerrilla war, and it was conducted by flying columns, and it was on the basis of ambushes, attacks on remote police stations, and assassinations, and then retaliation on the part of the British forces in Ireland, the army, the Black and Tans, and the auxiliaries. And the most notorious of those events there were 3 major ones. The first was the burning of Balbriggan, the burning of Cork. The city of Cork was torched in retaliation for an ambush at Kilmichael, not far away from Cork. And then, of course, most notorious of all was Bloody Sunday, where the assassination of a number of British military intelligence people in Dublin resulted that afternoon in the shooting of spectators and players at Croke Park on what became known as Bloody Sunday in Ireland. So not everyone in Ireland, of course, agreed with this resort to bloodshed on the part of the Irish Volunteers, who became known as the IRA eventually, originally the Irish Volunteers, but then eventually became known as the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. So not everyone agreed with them, but it was a complicated situation, and the politicians were maybe a little less enamored by what was happening on the ground, but some of the volunteers, were determined to pursue this battle against the British, believing that that was the only way in which we would ever get independence. So the question is, given that there were 50,000 British troops and soldiers, policemen, and auxiliaries in Ireland, and the volunteers had about 1,500 active people, how on God's earth did they manage to win the War of Independence and achieve a version of Irish independence in 1921? Well, three factors. First of all, they were determined, and they were ruthless, and they didn't make the mistakes they had made in 1916. They didn't make themselves into targets for the British. They relied on being able to move about the countryside, to hide away from British retaliation, and to conduct ambushes through what they call flying columns of people who were on the run, but were well able to take on the British where they found vulnerabilities on the British side. Secondly, I think it's true to say that the mentality in Britain had changed from the 19th century, where any rebellion of that kind in the 19th century would have been crushed with absolute ferocity. I remember reading once a quote by Wellington. Now, this was not about Ireland. This was about the tumult that occurred around the time of the Great Reform Act in the 1830s, when Britain was on a revolutionary kind of track, it appeared. And Wellington said to Queen Victoria in one of his maybe it wasn't. I mean, it was said to the King, actually. Well, it wasn't Victoria. It was before Victoria took over. He said, "Well, the British people will behave themselves, and if they don't, we know what to do with them." So, in other words, he was saying that even a rebellion in Britain, an uprising in Britain, would have been crushed with ferocity. So, a rebellion in Ireland in the 19th century would have been wiped out with overwhelming force. But by the 20th century, opinion had changed in Britain, and the British government just didn't have the will or the ability to use the kind of nuclear option of really going and crushing Ireland with vastly superior military force that they had available to them, but they weren't inclined to use it. And the third reason was they were afraid of international opinion ganging up against them, and in particular, they were afraid of the influence of Irish America, because there were two organizations with supportive. The Friends of Irish Freedom, and another one whose name I can't remember at the moment, but it was set up by De Valera. The other one was set up by Judge Daniel Colahan, from New York. And between them, they had like over 1 million members. So this was a serious lobby that deployed its influence quite effectively. And that, I think, made the British realize that if they proceeded with any kind of draconian measures in Ireland, that this would have damaged Britain's standing in the United States, which had now become the most powerful and important country in the world, and Britain needed to curry favor in Washington, and doing that meant not going too heavy on the Irish, because the consequence of that would be severe. So finally, a ceasefire was called in July of 1921. Negotiations took place. In December of 1921, you had the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which paved the way for the establishment of the Irish Free State. Now, those negotiations are extremely controversial, and the centenary of that particular time in Irish history, which will happen at the end of this year, will be quite tricky to manage, because there are still very deep differences between historians, and to some degree as well, among the general public, about whether what was achieved in 1921 was the most that could have been achieved, which was the view of Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith, or whether it fell short and Ireland should have held out for a fuller version of Irish independence that the people on the anti-treaty side believed, De Valera and others like that believed could have been achieved had they stood firm and had they come back to Dublin and then gone back again a second time, and they might have got a better deal. And that debate has bedeviled Irish history and Irish politics over the last 100 years, really. And now, of course, the irony is that this centenary will be reached with the two parties that are descended from those who took different sides in 1921 are now in government together. So that really ought to make it a little more straightforward to manage this centenary. But the centenary of the Civil War, again, 1922-23, where you had people who were formerly comrades in arms turning on each other, and you had, violent exchanges on both sides, and assassinations and executions and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff that has to be gone through. I mean, my own view of all of this is that there's no point at 100 years removed from these situations to start trying to make assessments of what would and wouldn't have been right or wrong at that time. These people made their choices. And the fact is that the choice that was made at that time has led to 100 years of Irish independence. It's led to today a country that's prosperous and outward looking and has been democratic for 100 years. It's no mean feat in the world of the 20th century, which Ireland had to maneuver its way through. And I mean, obviously, I would never claim that everything in the garden in Ireland over the last 100 years has been rosy. We've discovered recently with the mother and baby report that a lot of things, a lot of darkness in Ireland in those decades. But all I can say is that the legacy of that period, that couple of years of in Irish history between 1990 and 1921, is the state that I represent and proud to represent, have done so for the last 40 plus years, and Kevin represents in the Midwest. And, it's a state that is now number 2 on the UN Human Development Index. So it's not a perfect measure of our achievements, but it's nonetheless, it's a comparative measure, which puts us up at the very top of the tree in terms of, the countries of the world and how they have performed in terms of their ability to provide for good human development. So that's my story of the War of Independence and its legacy. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have or the audience may have this evening. Thank you. Got a minute, Margaret Claire.
Ambassador, thanks so much for that whip through the War of Independence. Lots to ask questions on and to think about. Tim, I was going to go to you first for a question, if you have a question for the ambassador.
Sure. Thank you very much. First of all, that was a great overview. You've done in 15 minutes what takes me 15 weeks.
I can do 15 weeks as well, by the way, if you want to employ me.
I wonder if you were getting at this to an extent there. I wonder if you could speak a bit to the international contexts, really the situation with World War I and then the immediate post-war world really changed the conditions as well. Cabinet restructuring, for example, in London in the middle of World War I certainly closed down the option of an all-Ireland home rule. And throughout the British Empire in the immediate post-war world, there were a number of hot spots which also constrained the way that they could respond in Ireland. So maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very conscious of that because I've served in India, and of course, when I was in India in the 80s, the legacy of the Irish influence on the Indian independence struggle was very much alive, and because there were people I met at that time who could well remember the Raj and remember the final stages of the struggle for independence. So yes, first of all, had there been no First World War, I think it's most likely that some form of home rule would have been delivered in 1914, and that it would have, whether it would have been delivered on an all Ireland basis or not, I think is an open question. But there was certainly a fighting chance that the British government might have somehow prevailed upon Unionists to accept some form of an all Ireland home rule. But the First World War really kind of killed that off, I think, because of course it did two things. It actually it kind of set the seal on Ulster Unionist conviction about their identity, and the blood spilled on the Somme and so on. Obviously, had an effect of only galvanizing and further strengthening their determination to be part of a British future. And on the Irish side, of course, it produced the Easter Rising, which was a game changer in Ireland, or turned out to be a game changer in the end. So in that sense, the international context was absolutely crucial. And it's hard to, I mean, for example, it's hard to imagine that the Irish volunteers controlled by Redmond and Dillon would have ever decided to conduct a rising of the kind that was conducted in 1916. There was only the split in the Irish volunteers that allowed the IRB and the more radical elements who were not prepared to fight in the First World War to assert themselves and to engineer that rising. And you're quite right as well. I mean, going into those negotiations in December 1921, what were the two sides looking for? On the Irish side, they were looking for independence and a republic. And they got a version of that. The British side, their primary concern was to avoid damaging the empire. Because in their minds, if Ireland, an integral part of the UK for 120 years, were to totally leave, as opposed to becoming a dominion like Australia and Canada, that would be a death knell, because other countries, other parts of the empire would want to follow suit. And, you know, I mean, if you look at the Treaty of Versailles, for example, I mean, the biggest sort of driver of that on the British side was to protect the empire. Protecting the empire was, I mean, the reason the Middle East was, you know, the reason the map of the Middle East was redrawn in 1920 was to facilitate the preservation of the European empires. So I think international context, and then forget about, even if you leave that aside, the Irish American contribution, the fact that out Irish America, the British would have felt they had carte blanche to kind of, put manners on the Irish, but with Irish America in the background agitating for Irish independence, that option, I think, was kind of closed off. And there's a new book on that, by the way, by Francis Carroll, just come out from NYU, which I'm looking forward to reading, because I'm really fascinated to delve into that and see exactly what that influence was. But if you look at the size of the Friends of Irish Freedom and the other organization that was set up by De Valera, I mean, significant numbers of people, and a lot of money was raised, and it must. I mean, I'm sure British diplomats in New York and Washington and elsewhere were reporting back, these people are serious, and we better not take them lightly.
Ambassador Tim, thanks. Colleen, over to you for a question.
I'll unmute. Thank you. I'm the non-academic on this panel, but
so am I. I'm an ordinary citizen as well.
But you sound like one, Ambassador.
Thank you.
However, I am an avid reader of Irish history, so I'm going to talk about the women's contribution. I would say that contribution of Irish women, both leading up to and during the war, is often unrecognized. So could you address the role that Cumann and Bán played during this time?
Yeah, look, I mean, I apologize for not including that in my 15-minute summary, okay. but I'm happy to cover it now. I mean, look, Ireland is an example of a country which, in the first 20 years of the 20th century, was really, to use a modern word, progressive, in the sense that women did play a big role. I mean, go back to the visit of Queen Victoria to Ireland in 1900. That's when Maud Gonne established what she called Ineen na hÉireann, and they kind of set up alternative activities for Irish children, so they wouldn't be drawn to the pageantry of the royal visit. And she organized a kind of an anti-royal gathering of Irish children in Phoenix Park. So even from that time, there were a lot of Irish women who were involved in what you would call political activities, and that wasn't common in other parts of the world. In 1916 itself, I mean, you had obviously Constance Markievicz, but you had many other, Margaret Skinner and people like that, who, I mean, I'm not saying they were by any means a huge number of women, but there was certainly a significant number of women involved. Now, most of them were involved. Some of them were even involved in combat roles, which again was quite extraordinary for that period of history. But mostly it was auxiliaries, doing nursing and so on. I mean, so Irish women played a significant part, and then obviously Sinn Féin put up 2 women for seats in the 1918 election, and one of them, Constance Markievicz, won a seat. The other one was put up in Dublin in a unionist area, which was always going to be a hard struggle for Sinn Féin to win. So she didn't win. But nonetheless, you had the first woman elected to the British Parliament, an Irish woman, Constance Markievicz. She became the first cabinet minister. She was briefly a member of the provisional government. And then after the split, Republican women became a real force. And you think about some of the leading sort of opponents of the treaty were Irish women. Muriel McSweeney, Thomas McSweeney's widow, his daughter. You had Margaret Pearce representing her sons and so on. You had Kathleen Clark, the widow of Tom Clark, and you had a whole swathe of women. In fact, Cumann na mBan mostly went against the treaty, whereas in most other parts of the nationalist spectrum, there was a small majority, and sometimes a big majority, for the treaty. So women did sort of carry the flame of sort of Republican sort of devotion. I mean, Maud Gonne, Constance Markievicz, all these people never bent in their dedication to the Republic. Now, whether they were right or wrong is neither here nor there. But the terrible irony is that in the 20s and 30s, Ireland became a very conservative place, and women kind of had to retreat from the public space. Yeah. And I know that, I mean, if you think about Dorothy McCardle, for example, who was a member of the McCardle family who owned the brewery in Dundalk, so very prosperous, went to Alexandra College in Dublin, taught there, lost her job, in fact, because she was a dedicated Republican. She wrote in 1937 to De Valera, complaining bitterly about the provisions of the Constitution that appeared to put women back into the home and deny them their place in the public sphere. So a lot of the women who were radical in the 1920s found themselves very disappointed by the evolution of Ireland in the decades after independence. But that's another story, and it's a complicated story, and I'm not quite sure I understand the dynamics of it. But from being a radical space in the 1910s and early 20s, Ireland then became this notoriously conservative place for decades afterwards. And that's a puzzle that I think we'll have to wait for another day to try and unravel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Colleen. Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, it's really interesting if you look at, we look at 100 years ago, but it's also an opportunity to look at the 100 years, I suppose, the road that Ireland has travelled since then. I know this is just a short session, so I have just one final question for the Ambassador. Where can folks learn more about this period of Irish history?
Well, there's a lot of material available. For example, there's a centenaries project which is been going on for the last 10 years, and they post some very good accessible material on their website. I think it's called centenaries.ie or something like that. But anyway, you'll find it, or certainly the consulate or the embassy will be able to point you in the direction of that resource. Also, I have discovered over the last 3 years in traveling around the United States that there's a great passion for Irish history in this country, and that a lot of people, said to me that they want to know more about Irish history, and particularly that period in the run up to independence. So I decided there a few months ago to initiate a series of panel discussions called A Farther Shore, because I think that Ireland navigated its way to a farther shore, the farther shore of independence, which would have been inconceivable in 1912, ended up being a reality in 1922. So I used that phrase from Seamus Heaney's poem, The Cure of Troy, as an inspiration for this series to try to explain what that journey was that brought Ireland to the farther shore of independence in 1922. So it'll be a series of 7 or 8 panel discussions. We've had 2 already, and they're available on the embassy's Facebook page to watch. The first one was a review of the period between 1916 and 1919. That was hosted with Boston College. The second one was hosted recently with DePaul University in Chicago, and that focused on the War of Independence. And we'll have subsequent ones which will be organized in conjunction with places like Notre Dame, NYU, and so forth. So these we'll have scholars who know the period very well, but the accent of these events is to communicate with the general public. They're not for students, they're not for postgraduate students, they're not for academics, they're for a general Irish American public that wants to know a bit more about what happened in Ireland in those crucial years between 1919 and 1922. And a point I always make on these occasions, I make it again tonight, is that the First World War shook up the whole world, and a whole clatter of new countries emerged from the wreckage of the First World War. But in most cases, in almost all other cases, the countries like the Baltic states, like Czechoslovakia as it was, Hungary, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and so on, they emerged from the wreckage, Poland as well, from the wreckage of the empires of the 19th century that collapsed. The Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Turkish Empire, all collapsed either before or during or after the First World War. And Ireland was one of the countries that managed to prize itself free from one of the successful, victorious states of the Great War. After all, the British had just won probably the most consequential war, the bloodiest and the most destructive war in human history, alongside the Americans and the French. And yet, within a few years, they had to give up part of their home base when Ireland achieved its independence as the Irish Free State. And we should never underestimate the significance of that achievement, and we should never forget the period of history that brought that achievement about. And that's why I've initiated this series of events under the title of A Farther Shore. And details are available on the embassy website, or they're available from the consulate in Chicago, or any of our consulates will give you the details. And I will put all the login details for these events, which are all free, by the way. I will put them out on my Twitter account at Dan Mulhall on a number of occasions, running up to these events. But we've had 2 already, and there's another 4 or 5 to come. And I'm sure that those who have an interest in Irish history and this period will really benefit from tuning in to one or more of the coming events under the framework of A Farther Shore.
Ambassador, thanks so much. You can go to the embassy website, www.dfa.ie/USA, and it's just on the front page there. And our thanks to the American Conference of Irish Studies and all the universities involved for that. It should be a great series. You can watch it either live or it'll be recorded back, so you can dip in and brush up on the various aspects of Irish history as you see fit. I have to bring this to a close today. It was only a short chance to really touch on this topic. Hopefully you can join us for A Farther Shore for future events. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. Tim, as always, thanks for your insights. And Colleen, thank you again so much for the welcome and for making this possible. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.